There are a couple of people in this room that, including Mary, that I go way back with. And that's where I'm gonna start, way back in the 70s, when we went to this like, quote, experimental school in Western Mass called Simon's Rock. That's Michael Sussman,
Oh my
myself,
God.
and Mary.
I did
Wait.
recognize you when I came in, but I'm delighted.
So we're still here.
I've changed.
No, you haven't. I have. But anyway.
I'm sorry.
So it was Mary and I met. I think in the music room where she was probably playing piano and I was practicing some woodwind or another, and we struck up a friendship, and we've been friends ever since. But we haven't spent that much time until the Writer Center began about 15 years ago, and then she came up and did some stuff. So we're very happy to have her. But so that's the beginning. It's nothing. That's just the way we met. But then Mary went on to. I went on to quit school, and I think Michael, you did too. And we're brothers in arms there. And there were Mary has this 20-page curriculum, which I went through, and I was just amazed. So I'm just going to go through it briefly. After Simon's Rock, she went to Bennington and got a BA, got her MA at Boston University and her PhD at Boston University. So that's the schooling thing. But as I was going through her honors and awards, I found a couple of dozen, a few like a fellowship to the Institute of Advanced Studies, which, it sounds like you have to know a hell of a lot about science to go there, but maybe not.
Maybe not.
She was a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute. And I don't know, you know how to say that? Wissenschaft Gestheit.
That's not so bad.
All right.
Wissenschaftsgeschichte. Not so many I's.
Guggenheim in 2003, Philbart, a distinguished scholar, in 2003 again. She was nominated for a Pushcart Prize in 1999, and she has several humanities research fellowships. Now that's just all right. So this won't take more than 5 minutes. No, it won't. Then her books. Well, Wonder in Science, we're going to hear about tonight, Imagining Worlds in Early Modern Europe, she finished it in 1999. But she also, her first book was a book of poetry called Trouble, and then The World, the Flesh and Angels from Beacon Press, Begetting Images, Studies in the Art of Science and Symbol Production. And the last poetry book is The Witness and the Other World, Exotic European Travel Writing.
No, that's not poetry.
That's not.
It's prose, but I will tell you that there's some guy in Canada who is making a musical out of chapter 6.
Oh, cool.
And he's setting the prose to music.
Oh, nice.
So what do you know?
Wow. Wow.
He's not
Okay,
good
well,
chapter
speaking of poetry, she's been published in scores of mags, including The New Yorker and Commonweal, and dozens of anthologies. I didn't underline any of them. And she's been translated into Italian, Russian, and French. Correct? Any more languages?
Czech, actually.
Czech.
You know that poem, Sexual Terrorist, by this crazy punk singer.
Ah. All right. Well, there you go. Then, there's no. These are all of the articles. But what I found interesting was, that's it for the articles. There's like 8 pages of them. So for reviews, she's written reviews for Oxford University Press, in the Journal of British Studies, the University of Nebraska Press, the Renaissance Quarterly, and the University of Pittsburgh Press. Her Other journal entries are journal early modern history, and the Renaissance encounters with the strange and marvelous, University of Virginia Press, etc., etc. There's too many here to read because I'm only on page 10. But are these works in progress? These still happening?
Uh,
Dream Girl,
uh,
the Black Robes, and the People of Kanawaki.
yeah, Kanawaki, that was the place where Kateri Tekakwitha, the first indigenous American saint, who was canonized about, I don't know, just before COVID, I think. Yeah, so it's about her and people's obsession with her.
Okay. There's Mary's written for a lot of places in her career, and her professional memberships are in Academy for American Poets, Modern Language Association, Medieval Academy of America, Society of Literature, Science and Arts, Renaissance Society of America, Society of Fellows in Humanities, Friends of the John Carter Brown Library. Where's that?
Providence.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous. It's got every single book that's ever mentioned America from 1492, I guess, to 1800.
Wow.
Cool place.
Wow. Wow. Her teaching experience, she was a full professor at Brandeis in the English department starting in 1988 and retiring in 2017.
17. Yeah, a little bit early.
Well, that's quite a run. Geez, I thought I had something big to wrap it up, except I do. It's Mary Campbell. She's also on the board of the Writer Center, which is why she's really why she's here. We got her to come on down and get out of Cambridge. So with that, my dear friend, Mary Campbell.
Well, thank you for that beautiful reading of my piece. And also because we're having this series of, I think in honor of the very threatened situation of science in general in America right now. Hey, Dorothy. We're having a series of events around science. And so the last one, which I couldn't come to, was Joanne Hart's. I don't know if any of you went to that. I really wanted to go, but anyway, I had a thing that I had to do, and so I couldn't. And I am here in a slightly more boring way, because I'm not a science fiction writer, though I wish that I were, and it's probably the root of my intellectual life. But like many women who become kind of historians of science, it's because we were turned away. And I think it's happening less often now. There's more women in the mathematized sciences, but I'm old enough to still be one of the people who was told when I asked questions about higher math, you don't need to know that, quote, unquote. But I really was interested, so I got a domestic partner who was a scientist, and I started doing history of science, but from the point of view of a literary person. So this book was motivated by a couple of questions, which books generally are. And the question, I noticed that what we now are willing to call science, and what we absolutely call the novel, prose fiction of a certain length in the immortal definition of Samuel Johnson, that these things got going at the same time. And there are huge changes in already existing phenomena, cultural phenomena. That is, there's always been interest in the natural world. There's always been, well, not always, but for an extremely long time, in mathematics and astronomy, and and optics and harmony. These are the sciences that were plugging right along and not losing steam during the course of the post-Roman Empire, sort of the so-called Dark Ages, which weren't all that dark actually. But anyway, those, because harmony is a mathematical discipline, and so people can do math without, electron microscopes and so on. But there are some things that are harder to do without electron microscopes. But there's also a whole culture, a way we look at finding things out that's completely different than it was for a very long time during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And I don't mean everybody. There were always some really good empirical data gatherers and, people who were shy of wild speculation and so on. So there were people who had the personality of scientists, but there wasn't a scientific community. And then there was. And there was fiction. There were medieval romances.
What was the word you used? You said there wasn't a scientific
Community.
community. I
You know,
didn't
like
hear that.
now,
Right.
all these universities, whenever when all these awful things are happening to universities, what's really bad is like people at Harvard who have big grants to, cure pediatric cancer. They have a lot of scientists in those grants, and they're at different universities, and those universities have also lost the grant. So people focus in the newspaper on Harvard and MIT, well, not MIT, because they're, for some reason, they seem to be immune, but people focus on Harvard without ever mentioning that every Harvard grant is being lost to a lot of universities. And people don't talk about how many universities, it's just Harvard, 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 even if you're not reading the Boston Globe. But I have friends whose whole, like my former partner, a paleoecologist who has to study very long-term developments in the actual world, which is a problem because the actual world is changing rapidly. But he's a paleoecologist. He's studying the actual world of about 250 million years ago. But he's studying a lot. But what he was particularly interested in was the last global warming, the end of the Ice Age. And so that's much more recent. And his life's work, now 30 years of it, involved a number of universities in the Great Lakes area in Canada and the United States, and it involved setting up a bunch of fellowships to train to get, as PhD scientists, Indigenous people from the Indigenous nations around the Great Lakes, which are the heart of, the energy source of North America and the indigenous cultural world of North America and so on. They are the it area. Those lakes and all the major rivers that drain into and out of them, which were the highways of the old world and so on. So it was a really great project. And they were studying things that took decades to get an answer to. But it has to do with climate change, and so it's dead. So it's very important to me that this terrible thing is happening. But meanwhile, this book is about a period in which it was beginning to come into being at the same time as novels, as fictions which pretended to be true. They tended to be called the true history of X. The early novels, The True History and Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. But going back a century before that, the true history. True history meant false, meant fictional. And it was in prose, which fiction had never been, or since a few people in the late Roman Empire, like Petronius or something, prose was not a medium for writing stories that would entertain and be not true. And suddenly it was. And so I was very interested in how those two things emerged together at the same time as a number of major European countries were colonizing much of the rest of the world and setting us up for the incredibly bad situation we are now in geopolitically, to exploit the resources of other people's countries and exploit the peoples as usually slave labor, or else at any rate extremely oppressed labor. So there was a very bad geopolitical thing going on, and there were two quite good things going on, and they all had to do with each other. And I wanted to figure out what, why all at once, all these three things at once. And I don't have enough time left after the reading of my Vita to explain it all, but I did want to make a few points about it, partly because while science in our time is undergoing these horrible challenges that we're all going to suffer from or are already, it is also a moment, a challenge. The scientists are feeling very energetic because very frightened and very challenged, and so on and so forth. And it may be a moment that one of the features of how it emerged in this period might be reconsidered. But so rather than talk more about what I'm going to say, I will now say some of it. When you are watching things emerge that didn't exist before, and nobody knows what to make of them, particularly because they didn't, so there's no tradition, it isn't taught in school, and so on and so forth, you get a lot of hybrid objects, a lot of things which are neither fish nor fowl, and I love things like that. I love artworks like that. I love all kinds of things like that. And so, of course, I was drawn to this project in part just because it meant I could spend all this time with really hybrid, bizarro things that nobody much knew what to do with in traditional history of science. And certainly people hadn't been looking at as part of the history of, for instance, the novel. Here's one, for instance, on the cover of this book, which is also in your little packet. Does anyone have a clue what this is?
It's a fly head.
There you go. It's not a fly. Well, it is a fly head. It is a fly head made up mostly of the fly's eyes. It comes from a book called Micrographia, which is nothing but extraordinary engravings of the very first microscopically perceived objects.
Well, this was a Leeuwenhoek.
No, this is before. Well, I mean, these guys were whatchamacallit, they were they lived in the same rough period, contemporaries, but they were quite different people. In fact, Leeuwenhoek is a Dutch guy who actually discovered sperm, and now that Michael has brought him up, he is the other big micrographer of the period, because not too many people had any idea what the point was of having a microscope and making things look very big. But the difference between them as human beings was just extraordinary, and I will, I'll get to it a little bit later because it's part of my story actually. Leeuwenhoek was a much warmer personality, and he he had a much livelier sense of the aliveness of the very tiny things that he was looking at than Hooke. But I'm just bringing it up because it was sitting there right there in front of me as one of the kinds of extremely odd things that you are not going to see much of in contemporary science. We just don't. I read whatever I can in like the New York Times science page and so on and so forth, and the journalists are always good at coming up with stuff that do stir up feelings of sort of wonder and awe and just kind of wowness. But we're really used to the microscope and the telescope and to seeing photographs of life on scales that we don't see with our natural eyes. We've gotten used to that. But I'm saying, let's imagine a world in which the only scale people had ever seen anything in was the scale of their own natural eyes, and they didn't have very good eyeglasses. This is a world that doesn't have novels, it doesn't have realistic fiction, it doesn't have algebra, it doesn't have the Cartesian graph, it doesn't have scientific instruments at first, it doesn't have data, it doesn't have a scientific community, and in fact, on the continent anyway, the people we might now think of as closest to being scientists in the natural sciences put out, when they published, books of, quote, secrets. And if they were really serious, they didn't put out books of secrets because they took the idea of there being secrets pretty seriously. And the idea of a bunch of them getting together at a table like this and arguing until they got something figured out about the actual nature of a cell wall or something was completely unimaginable to these people who made their living by having secrets and having people come to them with their secret recipe, whether it be alchemical or Paracelsian, the origin of kind of medicines that you take that are made from plants and minerals, or just nonsense. And some of it was good, some of it was bad, but the word for them was charlatan, which has become a very negative word in modern English and French and so on. It wasn't then, it just was the word for people like that. But now we think differently. So that is a world that's really different from us. And when you break it down into smaller parts, what does it mean to not have realistic fiction? For instance, one of the things it means is the idea of writing narratives that are not true about people who are not the Duke of Earl is unimaginable. Why would that be meaningful? Why would that be interesting to write a story about, Jane Eyre or Huckleberry Finn or etc.? It was very hard for people to wrap their minds around the idea that anything could happen to such a person, never mind that such a person could do something. And there was, in this moment when our idea of realistic fiction wasn't born, there was a similar kind of difficulty about natural science because it involved looking at materials that were very low on the totem pole, very low, like sperm. I realize it's high on the totem pole in many ways, but just in general, from a domestic housekeeping point of view, it's not. Or dirt, or some of the most famous early engravings of Hooke were of lice and so on, or the hairy legs of spiders. These things were not prestigious objects. So people interested in them were considered to be weird and fictional narratives about people that were the equivalents of that low on the totem pole. Also a little weird. And yet, interestingly, somehow, I did start looking through the microscope at shit and did start writing fictions about, you know, uh, non-aristocratic Spanish midgets. And that is curious. How does that happen? And what are the steps along the way? And one more thing to think about that was not in existence and is now is the hideous, impenetrable, deadly boring language of scientific papers, which is hardly even something that you would call language. That is, a lot of it is abbreviations and numbers, and the really important part is graphs and figures.
What was the last two words?
Graphs and figures. That is, you know, somebody who's really at work on something is likely to just skip all the language like anybody would and just go to the graphs and figures and get the information out. But it was a major job, and it occupied the energies of some really extraordinary people to learn how to write entirely without charm or interest or expressiveness or attitude or memorableness. It was hard to do, and it took a long time to do it. So that is part of the task of trying to figure this out. How did we end up at the end of this period with a couple of different languages? The language that's potentially the language that can carry poetry or gorgeous prose, and a language that can't and isn't.
Did that kind of dry prose come about in like the Enlightenment?
No, it got started really quite early in England, in the sort of mid 17th century. Earlier than that, I mean, Bacon. Let me read if I can find the great. Bacon was a beautiful writer, and he was the guy who was 72 and 73. He was the guy who says, well, I won't read you this whole passage, but moreover, whenever I come to Bacon was the guy that I was taught in school, was the inventor of modern science, of the scientific method, and so on and so forth, which isn't exactly true, but he certainly was writing theoretically urgent polemics about how we're going to gather knowledge from now on, how we're going to know its knowledge, etc. And here he is on getting rid of fables and stories. Whenever I come to a new experiment of any subtlety, though it be, in my own opinion, certain and approved, that is, I already think this, but I'm going to do an experiment anyway, I nevertheless subjoin a clear account of the manner in which I made it. You know that part of a scientific paper. The manner in which I made it, that men, and I do mean men, knowing exactly how each point was made out, may see whether there be any error connected with it, and may arouse themselves to devise proofs more trustworthy and exquisite, if such can be found. And finally, I interpose everywhere admonitions and scruples and cautions with a religious care to eject, repress, and as it were, exorcise every kind of phantom. Everything fictional. And at about 40 years later, when the Royal Society, which still exists and is sort of the NIH of Britain, when the Royal Society was founded, it started with a bang with a book called The History of the Royal Society, um, and it has an equally famous passage about removing metaphors and figures of speech, similes, anything that makes language sort of colorful and vivid. And it wasn't just that these people were being Puritans. In fact, most of them were not Puritans. But Puritans did very good science at the time. It was that they were desperate to create a language that could convey information without conveying bias or opinion or personal investment in the information. And they were so desperate that, and that's I'm doing everything in the wrong order now, but that's fine. That they began to try to invent something they called the real character, which would be a language that wasn't a natural language, but a created language in which all the words and the grammar of it would be such that it could only convey systematic ideas about data. And this produced an explosion of interest in language, period.
This was before the English dictionary was
Yes.
really formulated.
Well,
Were they working in Latin?
when they were working on these real characters, they were making up the words. They were not. Oh, do you mean were scientists working in Latin? Scientists, yes, were working in Latin for the most part. Descartes, up through the middle of the 17th century, was writing in Latin. But in England, scientists had begun to start writing some things in English. And that was one of the interesting things about the Royal Society, which got started in the 1660s, was that its publishing language, for the most part, was English. Another low thing, like studying dirt or telling stories about common people. They would occasionally put something in Latin, and it was really interesting to me what they would put in Latin. And one of the most striking things for me in the early few years was that they felt compelled to put their experiment in vivisection of a living dog in Latin. And I think the idea was that women didn't know Latin and therefore couldn't read anything that horrible and that upsetting.
That women weren't allowed to participate in church and as in the ceremony.
Right, they still aren't in the Catholic Church.
In any leadership way.
Yeah.
And that's right.
Yeah, and Latin as the language of learning was, you just had to be lucky and have an older brother or father who would teach it to you. But there was this gradually democratizing feeling that if we could get more scientists, if we could have a bigger scientific community with information from a wider range of people, the sort of DEI of the 16th and 17th century, we could learn more. And that meant we should probably do it in the vernacular. And particularly if we were in medical science, it might be good to publish what we know in a language that ordinary people could read easily. So early gynecological manuals are in vernacular languages and so on. But, so the interest in Indian languages, not because, but the interest in Indian languages, the interest in the history of language, the beginning of linguistics, historical linguistics, but also theoretical linguistics, and the attempts to invent real characters that could convey only information was all going on at the same time. And one of the wonderful things that, and I will get to these in very few minutes, wonderful things that came of it was these imaginary languages invented by, the couple of people that I picked out to be especially interested in are George Salmanazar, who was a pet person of, in fact, Samuel Johnson, the dictionary man, who just thought he was an extraordinary person and would go and have tea with him all the time. He was an extraordinary person, but not in the way that Samuel Johnson thought. He was just kidding.
He perpetrated a massive fraud.
He did, very, very massive, and I don't think he ever got caught in his lifetime. I can't remember how it ended, but he pretended to be from Formosa, which is present-day Taiwan, but which at the time was a Japanese possession, and which nobody had ever been to. And so he created a Formosan language and a Formosan alphabet, and he dined, as they used to say, on this identity for decades. And Samuel Johnson was particularly interested in him. So this is his
Johnson
Formosan.
adopted him after he was found out.
So he.
And he was a hard case, and
But-
Johnson was sympathetic.
But didn't Johnson continue to believe that he was actually from Formosa? Wasn't it one of those things where he went on believing no matter what, kind of like, we're seeing signs of today? My feeling is that Johnson was a total fool for this guy. And I wish I could meet him, but I'm glad to know that he took care of him in his bad luck. And the other person that I just adore, and who is the person who ends my book, is Princess Caribou. This is not only her alphabet, but her handwriting and her doodle. I found it. Nobody had figured out what it was, but I found it in the Houghton Library, pasted into a kind of a scrapbook of things about Princess Caribou, who was a young woman from in the 18th century, early 18th century, who, during the period of enclosure, people no longer could just stay on the family land and farm and so on, and so they would go to the cities and become, if they were women in particular, they would go to the cities and become servants. And she had done that, and she had been a servant in the home of someone who taught her to read and who had a lot of travel books, beautifully illustrated travel books, because they were a very hot kind of literary fad at the time. And so she read all these travel books, and she decided, after she got pregnant from this sailor who had been to places like Formosa and all over the sort of Asian world in merchant ships. But he got her pregnant, so she had to go to the I'm pregnant and I'm not married place and have the baby. And then, of course, she couldn't get a letter of recommendation because she had gotten pregnant, because she was wicked. So she disappeared into the countryside. She hung out with some gypsies for a few weeks. She learned some gypsy cant, which was another language that people were really interested in. And she started to dress like them, and she showed up on the doorstep of a wealthy merchant in Bristol. And the merchant's wife was very taken with her. She's speaking her own invented language of Javasu, the place she claimed to have come from when she was eventually learned enough English to talk about it. And scholars from all over the British Isles and even from France would come to talk with her and try to analyze her language, because they were linguists and they were really fascinated by this extremely distant language that had no relationship to European or Slavic languages that they knew about. And she finally got caught because, of course, she did know English. They did try all kinds of tricks on her, and she was really good at not being tricked. They'd wake her up suddenly and things like that. But she was writing something, and she heard someone in the corner of the living room talk about how Asian languages were all written from right to left. And she had been writing from left to right, and she corrected herself and started writing from right to left immediately. And that was that. then they knew that she could understand English really well from, all the way across a vast, wealthy person's drawing room. So things didn't end that well for Caribou. She did not have a Dr. Johnson. The Worrells were understandably hurt that she had preyed on their gullibility and their generosity, and it didn't occur to them that she might have had good reasons to do that. But I really love Princess Caribou. But this is the end of the period when this fascination with language and the structures of languages could become a weapon, not a weapon, a tool for people who were making fictions out of themselves. And by this time, by the time of Caribou, there was prose fiction, recognizable prose fiction that people recognized as prose fiction, and unlike the case of Gulliver's Travels, where people actually thought he was real. And there is an amazing plenitude in the British Library of letters to Lemuel Gulliver and diatribes against some of Lemuel Gulliver's positions. And how many people have read Gulliver's Travels?
At some point.
At some point is fine, but no point means that I'm not going to go on about this great
Well,
length.
Swift he was a big deal at the time. He was an innovator.
Yeah, he certainly was. This whole book was written to make his book understandable, and then I decided, yes, but I didn't want to talk about his book because his book was like the sort of aftermath of this period of hybrids and welters and people not knowing what they were doing and nobody knowing whether something was true or false and so on, in a much more extreme way than his book. But it started with my
It
love
was
of that
Johnson's favorite book.
book. Right, and George Salmanazar was Johnson's favorite person. But a lot of people, even then, because it came out in 1727, I think, or 24, even then, there were plenty of, upper middle class, educated people who thought there was a guy named Lemuel Gulliver and that he had gone to a country where he was a giant and everybody was tiny, and he had gone to a country where he was tiny and everybody was a giant, and he had gone to a country hovering in the sky, a rocky island hovering in the sky where people were doing lots of scientific experiments that were completely ridiculous and very funny jokes about the kind of science that amateur scientists were doing at the time, but also very kind of reactionary jokes about quite good science that people were doing at the time. And there was a country where Gulliver, Mr. Gulliver to you, was found it very revealing to live with the rational society of speaking horses. So these people, there are some people who wrote to him and it was obviously a big joke and they were very witty and wonderful, but there were some people who just believed that these things were real. And that is really interesting to me. This is a world without maps and without clarity about how to tell what's real and what's not. And on the one hand, it produces fiction masquerading as true histories, and on the other hand, it eventually produces science, which we like to think in this moment is a case of something that clearly presents itself as real. As Bacon says, I take pains to make it clear how I did this and why it is true.
I was just thinking when you said that, how we're still having that problem, how to tell what's real and what isn't real.
Well, it's like, I don't know if we're still having it. I think we're suddenly having it again. And I put it down to Nixon, the education president, the guy who started the whole process of defunding education
Of what?
defunding education.
Right.
I mean, he called himself the education president, and he did what he could
Right.
to make it less accessible, especially to people in the South. And that was going to have results, and it did. That doesn't mean that there haven't always been some really interesting people out there with interesting beliefs and belief systems, all of whom I'm very interested in and love. But as a majority, for a while we were all kind of, learning some kind of ABCs of how to know things and to know that they were true things,
Mm-hmm.
and how to test them to make sure they were as true as they looked, and so on. But this was a world in which it wasn't like a matter of ideology or inadequate education or anything. Nobody knew.
It's also it's kind of a time when people are coming upon things at the edges of their known world that are marvelous and wondrous. So somebody like Swift can get away with it in
Yes.
a way because there are lots of new things. There are people moving around and showing up in London and who are very unusual, and they've got traveling shows full of people that they've brought from all around the world. So it doesn't seem so impossible that there might be a place where horses talk.
Well, that's completely true. And did you ever see that great movie about the production of the Gilbert and Sullivan opera? The one that's set in
Mikado?
China.
It is so
Yeah,
if you
the
think
Mikado.
it's so.
Huh?
Oh, I'm thinking of Pirandello.
Oh.
It is so if you think it's so.
Oh yeah, well, phew, those are words he may be spinning in his grave about. But the thing I wanted to add about these shows in which people eventually, because that's the setting of the Mikado, that wonderful movie. It was called Topsy Turvy. It shows you Gilbert going to this ethnographic fair. In which he goes from stall to stall and sees people from different countries conducting their daily routines as a kind of theater. And this theatricality of culture is everywhere in the texts that I look at in this book, including in the very most serious ones, the ones that we still think of as fundamentally informative science, the later kind of anthropology of the 18th century in Canada and China. It's everywhere, the idea that culture is a form of theater. So you see it kind of crystallized in those 19th century ethnographic fairs or world's fairs, even into our time. It's such a great movie. I can't, of course, Henry, what's your password? Get back to my notes. Sorry, do you know it, or do you want
Well,
to
for
type
what
it
program is it?
in? Well, I just can't get into your computer.
Oh,
And so
okay, yeah, 1957.
Oh, okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So, of course, that Gilbert and Sullivan opera would be another great way to end the book. It's very hard to end the book. Is a case of kind of turning ethnography into theater, comical theater. But it started really early in the 16th century. Montaigne has a famous essay about the visit of several Native Americans, I think from Brazil, to the court of whichever king was the king of France at that particular time in the late 16th century. But and Edgar Allan Poe has a famous short story about that real event. And they were brought out in front of all the aristocrats, of which more tenuous one, and danced their dances and sang their songs, and that sort of thing was also happening in London from time to time. But in London, about 50% of the time, they were phony.
Tell me what?
They were
They're
phony.
fakes, right?
They were
phony.
fakes, yeah. That
Good
happened
money
more.
to be made.
Yeah, there was money to be made. It happened a lot more in London than it did in France. Who knows? Who knows exactly why? Well, it's 8 o'clock and I got here late, so I will just go on a few minutes, sort of closer to my, a little closer to my notes, just so that you don't feel like you waited a long time for me to show up. And then, I'll tell you why a couple of these stunning pictures are in here. First of all, on the first page, I wanted to show you the carefulness of John White's watercolors. John White went over with Raleigh's first expedition to Roanoke in the late 16th century, and he was brought as an artist, and he did a lot of drawings, which watercolored drawings of plants, animals, people, landscapes, and so on and so forth that are extremely accurate and well done, and even nicer in color. And then, when the written account was produced in this very famous, very great series of big travel anthologies put out by the Debris brothers, they took his watercolors, they borrowed them, and they made these Mannerist engravings. So on the top here is his watercolor of two Virginians having dinner, and then underneath is Theodore Debris' Mannerist engraving of it. And on the next page is an even more Mannerist engraving of a mother and daughter, the daughter playing with a doll, which is dressed up as a late 16th century English aristocratic woman. And also playing with what looks like a scientific toy. The engravings in the Debris books are, you could, and people have, really write a book about the ironies of them and so on and so forth, and that's not what I wanted to do. I just wanted to just kind of display the difference, but what was already going on, what information about these faraway places and their wonders that you bring up was being produced, but it was being also translated almost immediately into art. And even when, for instance, Galileo writes his book saying, I've been out there night after night with the telescope kind of on these freezing cold winter nights that are really good for looking at the stars, or cramped in between the chimney and the roof, and it looks like there's 4 moons around Jupiter. And this totally revolutionized everyone's idea of the cosmos. A lot of people refused to believe it, refused to believe that the telescope was showing real things, would try his telescope and say, I can't see anything, which I know that feeling. I have tried small telescopes and microscopes and said, I can't see anything. But it's partly because I have double vision. But the language in which he talks about it, and Galileo is later. Let me just read you 2 or 3 sentences of Galileo in the book that publishes this extraordinarily important scientific discovery, along with another really important set of images of the movement of the planets through the fixed stars, and of the moon and the phases of the moon. I mean, this is a hugely important science book. But I'll just read you a little bit of two different dialects he speaks in the same wonderful and beautifully illustrated book. He's talking about earthshine here. At first glance, I see only a slender shining circumference on account of the darker parts of the sky bordering it, while on the contrary the rest of the surface appears darker because the nearness of the shining horns makes our sight dark. But if one chooses a place for oneself so that those bright horns are concealed by a roof or chimney or another obstacle between one's sight and the moon, but positioned far away from the eye, the remaining part of the lunar globe is left exposed to one's view, and then one will discover that this region of the moon, although deprived of sunlight, also shines with a considerable light, and especially when the chill of the night has already increased through the absence of the sun. So here's Mr. Hardcore detail. How I did this. The setup of the experiment. And then here he is again, still trying to talk about earthshine as the source of the moon's lumen scenario. He says, "What are we to propose? That the lunar body or some other dark and gloomy body is bathed by light from the earth? But what is so surprising about that? In an equal and grateful exchange, the earth pays back the moon with light equal to that which she receives from the moon almost all the time in the deepest darkness of the night." And he goes on to talk about the embrace of the moon and the earth and so on. And, he's not wrong. I mean, it's really one of the... I'm sorry, this is a digression, but there's a big question for a long time in this period whether the moon just was still, it didn't rotate. Because all we ever see is one side of the moon. We never see the other side. It does, as you may recall from the 8th grade, rotate. But it takes an entire month for it to rotate. And the story of how that got set up is so wonderful. Because the moon is just a cast-off chunk of flaming matter from our planet. So when it gets up there and starts to circle our planet, it's an oval. And it's gradually, by our gravity, and it's spinning around our gravity, turned into a ball, and it locks in through this means to... I can't remember what they call it.
Tidal locking.
Tidal locking. It locks into this kind of synchrony with the Earth's rotation that is absolutely touching. I mean, I can understand why Galileo burst into moments like this fairly frequently in his writing. And I had earlier wanted also to show you the great expurgator Bacon. And I may not be able to do it quickly, in which case I won't do it. But he is such a beautiful writer, and when he writes about the ignorance and the lostness of people of his time, and the need for a method that will allow us to track this dark wilderness. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and I am not going to be able to find it, but I'll just give you a little list of the things he thinks we should check out. This is from a long set of a catalog of particular natural histories that we should delve into with my method. Number 9. History of the blue expanse, of twilight, of mock suns, mock moons, halos, various colors of the sun, and of every variety in the aspect of the heavens caused by this medium. For 18, history of the greater motions and perturbations in earth and sea, earthquakes, tremblings and yawnings of the earth, islands newly appearing, floating islands, breakings off of land by entrance of the sea, encroachments and inundations, and contrariwise recessions of the sea, eruptions of fire from the earth, sudden eruptions of water from the earth. 71. History of smell and smells. 72. History of taste and tastes. 73. History of touch and the objects of touch. 74. History of Venus as species of touch. And by Venus he means sexual experience. I mean, his interests are in things that are very beautiful and very delicious, and there are hundreds of them, and this is one of my favorite books in the whole world, this catalog of particular histories. And he also wrote plays, he was a Renaissance man. But it isn't just that these scientists had a tendency to write or paint in ways that were beautiful and then to try to repress themselves with the other hand. As you were intuiting, the plethora of things out there was just extraordinary for writers. And they began to write a very strange kinds of books that were not about dukes and earls, but that were about planets.
We're about what?
Planets,
I'm
as in the moon,
Right.
Mars, Jupiter, and stars, and even the sun. Cyrano de Bergerac, who, is not just the object of a 19th century play, but also was an absolutely extraordinary 17th century French writer and thinker. And he wrote accounts of not only a voyage to the moon, but also a voyage to the sun. Obviously not interested particularly in astronomical reality, but he had been reading books by real scientists who also took voyages to the moon and other distant orbs. But Kepler, whose lunar astronomy, which is the first serious case of looking at the solar system from the point of view of the moon. And it's mostly footnotes, and the footnotes are mostly math. But it is a story, and it is a story that got his poor mother in serious trouble. She was put in jail for witchcraft on account of it. Even though it only circulated in manuscript during his life, it is a story about a trip to the moon and the culture of the moon, and how people dealt with the fact that at any particular time you would be either in the blazing sunlight or freezing cold, and how they dealt with that ecological situation. And he was quite interested in the moon as a inhabitable, and at least in his fantasy, inhabited place, but it was simultaneously a science fiction and a work of serious mathematical astronomy. But some people, actually, who weren't scientists, got on the same track. And what they were doing was, on the one hand, taking their inspiration from astronomical works that were still being written in languages that they could interpret. And also, if they were educated, they'd had decent mathematical educations. But they were interested in travel books as well. And so for them, the moon or whatever planet, sometimes imaginary planets, were kind of stand-ins for America, the Americas. which were also completely unimaginary, and unimaginable and just different from everything, and too far away to go to, and so, but not quite as far away as the moon, so they could kind of release their imaginations a little bit more. And as they did this, they got deeper and deeper into the notion of the protagonist as someone who is having experiences, internal experiences, sensations, and some of those experiences frequently were the experiences of being oppressed, captured, treated as inferior by the people that the protagonists were visiting. And so the literature of science fiction was actually quite rich in the 17th century in Europe. But if you want to get and it often would include China as well, like people, or Canada. People would like take off from Canada or land in China when they came back, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, China was a particularly marvelous place to end up, because then if you were interested in languages, and all of these people were very interested in the languages of other planets, you were there in a place where people spoke a language which simultaneously didn't have an alphabet, as far as they understood it, and sounded like music. So Chinese became a big topic in science fiction of this period. And so did imaginary languages, or ideal languages constructed to, but it's very interesting that almost everybody becomes extremely inferior when they go to another world, which is a completely opposite to the arrogance, if you've ever read any of the travel writing from that period, of how people tended most of the time to talk about the peoples of particularly the Americas and later on Australia. But so, while these characters are learning through the business of being oppressed and captured and enduring various dangers in the travel and so on and so forth, while the sort of ability to write more and more about their internal lives expanded in a way that you don't really find it in medieval romance or even Renaissance romance. It moved in the direction of women protagonists, which is also completely unusual for European literature over the previous millennium, because I think in part it may have been a little easier to put women in the situation of being imperiled, captive, and so on and so forth than men. But it isn't. So many of the protagonists were either women or, like Cyrano de Bergerac's protagonist, described as if he were a woman, even though he isn't. I mean, he's described frequently as pregnant in the beginning of the text. He is, when he gets up to the moon, his character is put in a cage with a previous character from a previous moon book by Bishop Godwin, who's a bit more of a scientist than Cyrano de Bergerac. And he is expected to mate with the previous protagonist, who is a very, very minor and also very, very small, kind of miniature Spanish minor aristocrat, like the 14th son of a guy who was at the very bottom of the elaborate aristocratic totem pole, and is one of the first of the so-called picaresque heroes who, they don't have anything, they don't have land, they don't have reputations, they don't have family, and they go wandering and they have adventures. And Don Quixote is the famous climactic example of that. But so that Diego is one of those characters. He experiences all this captivity and oppression and so on and so forth as a very tiny person who goes to the moon, and everybody is a big, very rational, very wealthy, and very, very well-mannered and cultivated giant. So he's even smaller than he was when he was at home. And then, of course, comes Cyrano, and Cyrano is expected to mate with him and get pregnant. But so anyway, there was this kind of move, even when the protagonist was male, towards being either little like a woman or getting pregnant like a woman. Or there were these feminine qualities that gradually produced the greatest, and I will stop there even though I'm nowhere near the end of these things, but it's time to go. The greatest science fiction book of the 17th century, and also the very first thing I would totally call a novel in England, Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World. Has anyone read it?
What's the title?
It's called The Blazing World, or that's the short version, The Blazing World.
Blazing.
Yeah. She has this, princess who is stranded in the North Pole. Everybody dies on her boat. I can't remember why. And there she spends the winter, kept warm by the brilliance of her beauty, and rescued finally by these multicolored bears who take her through a kind of portal from the North Pole to the similar pole of another planet, where she almost instantly becomes the empress of that planet. And she's read all the other science fiction books, so she's taken the best bits of all of them and she puts them in there. In fact, my father worked for Firestone his whole life, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, and I found out when I was studying these books that Firestone was named after the thing which she picks up from an earlier book but makes climactic and calls a firestone in her book, because she's all about blazing. She's all about wearing diamonds up the wazoo and everywhere, and carrying scepters that are just carved out of single diamonds, and sitting in chairs that are carved out of single emeralds. And when she decides to go to war, she sends out these ships just rigged with diamonds, and she stands in the prow, kind of like, in the Titanic. And she uses the firestones, which rain down. They're like white phosphorus. They create fire, terrible fire that you cannot put out when they hit the ground or even when they hit the water. And she rains down these firestones all around her, and there she is, blazing, creating this fire everywhere, and just destroying everything. I know I sound a little over enthusiastic about that, but I have to say it is the first case known to me in world literature of a woman who gets to wreck a bunch of shit. Yeah.
Is this 17th century or?
It's 1668. It's late 17th century, mid-late 17th century.
I'm looking forward to the movie.
Well, actually, there is a whole cult of Margaret Cavendish. And I have already written a little article about some small movies. But I believe there is actually now a real movie, like a feature-length movie being made, because me and my students and a bunch of my friends have created the Margaret Cavendish Society about 25, 30 years ago, and it is now just like a total worldwide thing. We have members from Formosa and from the Blazing World, and I mean really from everywhere. And you can get copies of the Blazing World in Japanese. You could get them. It's, and I think it's partly that it's not because men like this book too, but women really, really like it. It's very, very crazy. And the generation of people that taught me, the women were very embarrassed by Margaret Cavendish because they thought of her as, just not an Enlightenment writer, not not particularly witty. She's funny, but she's not witty, and not rational. And her climactic section, in a way, is when she goes against this image. And I will end by reading you a little thing she says about what's wrong with Robert Hooke's, by that time, extremely famous image. It's a very short little passage in a much longer passage. Oh shoot! Wait a minute, I'm sorry. That's me on the subject of the passage. I want to find the passage itself. Huh. Oh, here it is. If the picture of a young, beautiful lady should be drawn according to the representation of the microscope, or according to the various refraction and reflection of light through such light glasses, it would be so far from being like her as it would not be like a human face, but rather a monster than a picture of nature. She imagines herself as a version of the fly. That is, that you got your scientist, you got your lab table, you got your fly, you got your scientific equipment. She automatically, without thinking about it, identifies with the fly correctly, because a lot of early science was about women.
Like Emily Dickinson identified with a fly.
Yes, I heard a fly buzz when I died.
One thing I wanted that's coming up for me with that is a passage from Edward Said.
Yes.
The theory, in which he's talking about this period of narrative and imagination in European narrative and imagination, and the scrutiny of that imagination on people,
Right.
on
Others.
colonized,
Yeah.
allowed the European imagination to project into their colonial endeavors. That there was that he read these moments in fiction that you're reading in that exact, and with that quote that could really just as easily be applied to
Yes, to
to
any
colonize
colonial
people.
figure
colonial subjects.
or
It's
any
a really interesting quote.
enslaved person that
Yeah.
was in Britain or France or Portugal at the time. Or yes, I mean, this is the first. It's not the first book because Diego, the little Spanish midget, also experiences being scrutinized and examined, and so does Cyrano. Part of the Voyage to the Moon, but always in relation to being, and I think Said points this out, that there's something, yes he does, he says for Europeans the East, which is where they
Right.
were mostly going for trade reasons in the period that he likes to study, was feminized
Right.
by the by Europeans who wrote about them and studied them often with awe and pleasure and some accuracy and so on. But there was a kind of people always would talk about the East as indolent and beautiful and a source of kind of sensational
Fetish.
pleasures and definitely as the inventors of the fetish. So yeah,
And that fiction,
yeah,
European fiction,
right,
then entered into that.
yeah,
space,
and also
language.
drama. And drama did it earlier, but he didn't study drama, so he didn't write about that. But drama was doing
Thank
it
you for
already in the
clarifying that.
17th
I
century.
thought about that in a long time.
Yeah, and in the final analysis, you can read almost any text that I talk about in this book as a way into how Europeans were thinking about others, the others that they were finding and needed or wanted to exploit. And what's interesting to me is that not everything, I don't totally agree with Said, though I totally respect and admire his book. Not everything was a case of that kind of objectifying scrutiny and so on. One of the points of this book is that there were extraordinary moments in these hybrid literary objects of empathy. And that's why I had wanted to find that passage in which Leeuwenhoek talks about the behavior of the sperm. So maybe we could just as a little bright note, I'm going to look in the index and I'm going to find that note, and it's just like a sentence or two because I don't want you guys to fall asleep on me. There we are. 213, a note. Okay. I just love that guy. Oh yeah, here's my note. Perhaps the most familiar instance of Cavendish's face-off with Hooke is the passage in which he is shown a flea and a louse through the microscope of the bear men. The Empress, after the view, quote, the Empress, after the view of these strangely shaped creatures, pitied much those that are molested with them, especially poor beggars, which, although they have nothing to live on themselves, are yet necessitated to maintain and feed of their own flesh and blood a company of such terrible creatures called lice. Even the humble artisan genius Leeuwenhoek, discoverer of the spermatozoa, had a more empathetic relation to microscopic observation than Hooke. Quote, I see in this water, or on the duckweed, many wonderful animalcules, little animals, some of them getting their food from it, and others, as I imagined, using it as a skulking place to avoid being devoured by little fishes.